Hey, Joey here with Turtle Labs. So you just purchased a used RC crawler, or you're thinking about purchasing a used RC crawler. Purchasing a used RC crawler can either be a great experience or a very bad one. If you're just trying to get into the hobby, I would recommend buying a new RC car, kit or ready to run. RC crawlers usually get used pretty hard and then often get put away wet. If the previous owner didn't care for the vehicle well, there might be some hidden problems that you just didn't notice at first glance, or even on a test run. Stripped screws, rusty bearings, and broken internals could be lurking within the plastic casings, and that's not what you want, especially when you're just getting into the hobby. In this case, a friend of mine purchased this used axial bomber, which was ready to run, and not only were there some weird things going on with it, but it also came with some questionable electronics. The electronics that came with this truck were a Traxxas brand, likely pulled from another vehicle that the previous owner owned. It was probably tossed in this rig for a quick sale, and it ran when my buddy purchased it, but it wasn't long before the motor quit and it just stopped working altogether. I mean, let's be honest, when Traxxas electronics are new, they're still not even that great anyway, so not surprised here. The transmitter and receiver were just a generic cheap Redcat racing piece from a low-end RC from like back in the day. Again, probably just tossed on this thing for a quick sale. Anyway, let's dig into this thing and go over a couple things that you should look for when purchasing or after you've just purchased a used crawler, and make sure this thing will run as good for you as possible until you're ready to upgrade or move on to another rig. In order to get a good idea with what we're working with, we first need to toss this thing on a stand and pull the wheels. For a chassis like this bomber, it's a good idea to remove all the body panels so we can gain access to the electronics and mechanical parts that drive this rig. First, we want to dump all the electronics that this thing came with and start with a clean slate. Then, dispose of said electronics appropriately. This rig has a little dirt and sand on it, so off to the sink it goes. We like to spray our rigs down with Simple Green, let them sit for a few minutes, then hose them down. And then after that, blow them dry. Next, we open our new electronics, which consist of a Hobbywing Quick Run 1080 G2 electronic speed control, a Surpass 550 can size brush motor and a 35 turn flavor, and a Power HD LW25MG servo. We start this rebuild by installing the motor and the pinion gear. Then we install the servo, but not the servo arm yet because we need to hook up the receiver so that the servo can go to its center before we install the arm. There aren't too many flat spots on this chassis, so I use the servo as a mount for the ESC and receiver. It keeps it nice and tight and keeps the weight right on the front axle. In order to keep the wires tidy, we wrap the wire around a hex driver to give it a coil and shorten the overall length significantly. After plugging everything into the receiver, we power it on and make sure everything is working correctly and let the servo center. After a little application of some thread locker, we can install the servo arm. The rear pinion angle on this truck was very sharp, so we ended up flipping the rear control arm bracket so we can straighten it out a little bit. It's a good idea to hit all your joints with some oil. This goes for universal joints, rod end, and any other pivoting parts. Since we don't know the history of any of these fasteners on this thing, we remove all screws that are installed in the metal and apply thread locker, especially the drive shaft rep screws. When you get a used rig, sometimes you find some little surprises that you just didn't expect. Since RC crawlers are often driven in the water, it's a good idea to check all your bearings for any rust or damage and make sure they're lubed up. Last, we want to make sure our diffs are cleaned and re-lubed before sealing them back up. Alright, now that we've upgraded the electronics and looked over a couple things, we know that this truck is solid and it's ready to hit the trail. And after doing some testing on our personal rock crawler course, this thing's a beast. The Hobbywing 1080 G2 ESC is tried and true, and this newer model, the G2, has like a real driving mode that makes the truck act a little more realistic. I haven't really dabbled in that, but I hear it's a pretty cool feature, but kind of gimmicky. I don't know. And it also has a cool feature where you can also adjust the drag brake from your transmitter. That's pretty sweet, because sometimes you want to crawl and you want a heavy drag brake. Sometimes you want to trail drive, and when you let off the gas, you want it to roll a little bit. So it's nice to be able to make that change real time. I swapped in the transmitter for my old TRX4 because I had one laying around, and my buddy needed one to just get him up and running. It'll hold him over until he gets something a little bit better. With that said, I would not recommend spending the money on another Traxxas transmitter for your vehicle. I would probably spend a little more money and get a FlySky GT5 instead. Very solid transmitter, and the receivers are cheap, and it's nice and light, works great, and you can store a bunch of vehicles in it and use it on other RC cars too. And honestly, for a crawler, unless you need a bunch of channels, if you have winches and all kinds of other things, I don't really see a reason why you'd need to upgrade from that anyway. To pair with the 1080 ESC, we went with a cheap Surpass 550 can 35-turn motor. Even at its cheap price, it's plenty for this rig. It's hard to pass up the reliability, cost, and low maintenance of a brushed motor system on a crawler, really. Brushless definitely has advantages, but with a cost. So brushed is still a solid system. Also, if the motor ever burns up, it's like 15-20 bucks for another motor. Slap it in there and you're ready to go. But brushed motors are pretty reliable, and it's unlikely you're going to do that unless you're just running in mud all day long, all the time. Now, the pinion gear that came on this truck was way too high of a gear, and it just had way too much top speed, and paired with the 12-turn Traxxas motor that I pulled off of this thing, it was just way too much. So I put a way smaller pinion gear on it. I'm not sure what teeth count it is. It looks like maybe a 11. And paired with that 35-turn motor, this thing has plenty of wheel speed and also a lot of slow crawling speed. So it's much better for rock crawling. The last thing we installed on the electronics side was the new servo. It's a Power HD LW25MG servo, which has metal gears and enough torque to keep this thing going through the rocks. Now, the servo was a little weak on the stock ESC settings with the BEC voltage of 6. If you get one of these little program cards, you can up it to 8.4, and that completely wakes this thing up into a complete new animal. It was able to move these 2.5 tires around no problem, and it didn't hang up or skip a beat. And also, I've had Power HD servos in a lot of rigs, and I've yet to have one burned up on me. So yeah, I recommend this servo highly. And it's like got this cool blue color. Now, unfortunately, while digging into this thing, we did find a couple strip screws in the axle housings, which are plastic. So they were probably just over-tightened from the previous owner. So these are going to have to be replaced if my buddy wants his hubs to stay on, including his wheels, which are attached to the hubs. But they're cheap enough, and that can be something down the road that he does. There was one screw that I pulled out, and someone had put Teflon tape around it to try and fill in the gap between the screw and the loose hole. And yeah, just don't do that. Just replace the plastic, or what the hell. The drive shafts on this thing are a mixed match of all kinds of different things, and I mean, what the heck. These things, I will be surprised if they last more than a run or two. And I've recommended that my buddy gets new ones, but that's just kind of what happens when you buy a used rig sometimes. The front drive shaft has like a hex thing on the front part of it, and the back was ground to a round-ish shape with a flat and a set screw holding it in, and it's not good. It's not good at all. It spins very out of round, and it's not going to last very long. But maybe a run or two before these drive shafts just grenade or fail in some sort of crazy fashion. Overall, though, I think that this thing turned out pretty cool. I'm not a big fan of the caged setup. It looks cool, but getting in here and working on stuff is kind of a pain in the butt versus just taking a body off and having like a typical ladder frame and being able to work on everything without reaching your hands in places and moving bars around. But I mean, it does look cool. You can't argue that. So as far as getting a used rig, again, if you're new to the RC hobby, I would avoid a used rig because it could ruin your whole experience for RC, and we don't want that. We want to grow the RC community. You want to have a good experience and go out and have fun. And if you can't afford to buy the right new rig, probably just hold off until you can. Anyway, I hope that this video helped you out a little bit. I know that when I got into the RC hobby 20 years ago and even recently, buying used RC cars is kind of a pig in a poke, they say. Sometimes you don't know what you're getting until you dig into it, and it could cost more money to restore it back to a functional piece than to just go buy a new one. So always keep that in mind. Even though some of the used ones look really cool, it might not be the best idea. Anyway, enough blabbering. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.